Good morning and good afternoon. We meet in this virtual space between Kraków, Poland, Bern, Switzerland, and Las Cruces, New Mexico, for a conversation with Brandon Hobson. Our chat today is part of the 13th edition of the Konrad Festival, organized by the Tygodnik Powszechny Foundation and the Kraków Festival Office. The incentive for our chat is a recent translation of Brandon's novel, Where the Dead Sit Talking, translated into Polish by Jarek Westermark. The book was the finalist for the National Book Award in 2018, and it's a beautiful and haunting coming-of-age story set in rural Oklahoma in the late 1980s about a Cherokee teenager growing up in the foster care system. The novel touches upon the intertwined topics of Cherokee identity, cultural independence, power, abuse, and intergenerational trauma, and I'd like to touch upon those topics today. So hello, Brandon, again, and I'd like to start with a question about your experience as a social worker in the American foster care system. You are now an academic teacher, but you worked in the foster care system for several years. And I'll be happy to hear to what extent has it informed your book?
Well, thanks for having me, first of all. Glad to be here. And thank you for the nice things that you said about the book. I worked 7 years in the foster care system and with kids who were locked up also for committing crimes and also on probation. And I worked with families. I did that for 7 years, as I mentioned. I used that experience to really inform this book, Where the Dead Sit Talking. I think seeing a variety of families and kids come through the system, and a number of kids who were native and placed in with families who are not native, and that mixture of cultures, a variety of different types of kids placed in foster care. I really used that to to think about the character of Sequoia, to think about George and Rosemary, as well as the foster family, the Trouts. So I thought a lot about the kids that I worked with when I started writing this book.
Would you say that there is still a systemic bias against Native families in the US?
Violence?
A systemic bias.
Bias. I'm sorry. In what context? In terms of foster care or in general?
Yes. In the context of placing children in foster care outside of their native culture.
It's not, as far as I know. I haven't been in foster care in over. I'm sorry, in social work in over 10 years. So I don't think it's as common as it used to be. What they have here is something called the Indian Child Welfare Act, which allows Native kids to be placed with Native families. However, some tribes do make agreements with the system to allow non-Native families to take in Native kids, and it's not a bad thing necessarily for Native kids to be placed with non-Native foster care families. It's seems quite common, or it used to anyway, and it's not necessarily. I didn't want the book to convey that it was a really negative thing necessarily, but that it is mainly for Sequoia in this book. It was really just being able to connect with the one other Native foster kid who was Rosemary.
For me, a sense of displacement is such a recurring and powerful theme of this book, but very broadly understood, probably. And also, what I find especially interesting is how you depict how very often can violence, and by violence I mean whether symbolic or literal violence, can be disguised as care.
Well, the foster family isn't necessarily violent in this book. They're very caring. I think that where the confusion, the confusion and the problems come in is them not understanding the culture of the kids that they take in, and so often they try to connect, but fail to do so often.
What made you choose this job in social work?
Why did I choose?
Yes.
My mom was a social worker, and I at the time I needed a job that I wasn't able to find a good teaching job at the time, and I know that I like working with young people, and so I thought, okay, well, this there's something therapeutic about helping people, and especially helping young people and children, and so I thought this would be this could be a good job for me, and at the time I needed a job with benefits like health insurance, and in the United States, healthcare, is probably not as good as it is there, and so I needed it's very expensive, so I wanted health insurance, and I also, again, I like working with young people, and so I knew that sounded like a job that I would find interesting and something that I would enjoy. And I did enjoy it for a while, but it's a very, very difficult job because you're exposed to so many difficult families and so many difficult examples of so many different kinds of trauma and violence, and it's very difficult.
And that's what made you quit it in the end, or?
That's part of it. That part of it was the difficult, but also I knew that I wanted to pursue my teaching career and my writing career, so I began a PhD program to study creative writing and go on to. I knew that ultimately I wanted to be in academia and teaching, and so I decided to leave social work. Yeah. It just wasn't my. It's not my complete. It's not my passion to be in that work. At one time, I mean, I did it for 7 years. 7 years is a long time, but ultimately my passion is teaching, creative writing, and writing myself.
Well, I don't want to read too much into your book, or maybe overinterpret, but while reading the story of Sequoia and reflecting on this very deep sense of displacement, as we said, I was thinking whether it in any way does this echo the history of forced displacements, and in this sense it would be not only an intergenerational trauma but a lived reality that still continues, the sense of being removed or detached from home, probably, to put it in the simplest terms.
Yes, and I write a lot about removal and the trauma that. And my new book in America is called The Removed, my new novel, and it also deals with the same themes. There's a foster child in it who is removed from the home, but there's also the history of the Trail of Tears, which is the history of tribes being removed from the eastern part of the United States and moved forced west by the U.S. government back in the 1800s, and that removal from their lands, and they ended up in Oklahoma, which is my home state, and the theme of removal and intergenerational trauma, how that continues to happen through generations, right? The trauma that we continue to feel, and how just being removed from your home is so traumatic. And that question that Chekhov always said, fiction should explore questions, right? Not necessarily give answers, but explore questions. And so that's where I began, was thinking about what the questions of what is home for the Cherokee Nation, for Cherokees, what is home for foster children, and so those questions continue to come up in my work, and there are the questions that I'm always interested in writing about.
So would you say that the answer to this question, how is home defined? What is home? Does it change with every generation? Is it constantly updated? Or is there just one timeless answer to that? Like a fixed set of values, or a certain sensibility. There are probably many ways to define home. It doesn't have to be a topographical place, I suppose. How do you see that?
Yeah, those are the questions that I like to explore. I don't know that there's one definitive answer, but I think that it continues to change depending on circumstance. I think that was a question at one time that was asked of the tribe because of the U.S. government forcing the removal. And so this is our home, but we're being forced out. My ancestors walking to what's now Oklahoma, which at the time became Indian territory, and is still to this day, I think, known as Indian territory. And so I don't know that there's one specific answer to the question of what is home.
I would say that in the novel, you also, if you give an answer to that question at all, then it is very open.
Ambiguous.
Mm-hmm. Or ambiguous. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because I think that there are no resolutions. There are no, right. We continue to see this question being continued to ask ourselves, and I don't know that the resolutions ever. The violence. Another topic is the violence against natives, which is never fully resolved. It still happens today. The police violence against natives is happening in the United States. In the 1970s, there was something called the American Indian Movement, which was started by a man named Russell Banks and another man, Russell Means, two founders, due to the violence, police brutality against natives. There are murdered and missing indigenous women in the United States. It's a terrible problem, which includes young girls, teenage girls, but it goes all the way up. Their age is it goes up to older women. 86% of women who are missing or murdered are indigenous in the United States, and according to the CDC. And so it continues to be a problem here. And those are, I try to bring light to those problems in my work.
Would you say that these problems? Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, I don't think that there's a resolution. There's been anything resolved.
Mm-hmm. Would you say that those topics are now receiving more attention in the public discourse, or not necessarily?
I hope that they are. I hope so. I mean, that's what I try to do with my work, is to raise awareness to these issues. And a lot of the students I work with are Native, also, and I have a passion for helping, especially Native writers. But I think it's becoming more and more discussed, which and less ignored, which in the United States, which is a good thing. It's good that we're starting to take notice. People who in the past haven't noticed it. So all I can do through my art is continue to raise questions and use my art as well as I can. I mainly write for myself. I don't write for other people, right? And I think it's mostly important to write for yourself and not to write when you're talking about art, which is literature and fiction. I think it should be entirely for yourself and not for other people. And other people can certainly enjoy it, but and I think a little bit about audience, but I try not to think too much. I try to write for myself and the books that haven't been written before, which the author Toni Morrison said, if a book that you really want to read doesn't exist, then that's the book that you want to write. And so that's what I try to think that for my own work. But I do that through the process of really trying to think of myself as the audience, and that's partly why some of the questions aren't definitely answered. There's no necessarily clear answer, and why there might be some ambiguity. And so, but I think art should not necessarily give answers, right? But art should explore the human condition, and art should explore big questions in the way that the artist is interested in portraying and examining those questions. Again, back to what Chekhov said.
Mm-hmm. You partly answered another question that I wanted to ask, which is, I was wondering whether you're ever concerned while writing about reinforcing certain prevailing stereotypes about Native American peoples when you write about those very difficult topics of substance abuse, suicide. Are you concerned about confirming or reinforcing those stereotypes?
What I tried not to do is write into stereotype, right? I don't want to write about stereotypes. There is a stereotype that exists that I try to write through. Is that what you're asking?
Yes, exactly. Right through it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right through the stereotypes. Stereotypes are dangerous, especially when you're talking about Native identity. So I tried to show that the idea of the way that the culture has decided to, and over the years that they have applied this specific stereotype to natives is not is not the way that we should be. Stereotypes are dangerous, right? So we shouldn't be thinking about. So I try to, through my characters and my work, is try to break through those, definitely. And there are urban natives that they're not all living on. Natives are living in cities, and they're not all living on reservations, right? So it becomes it becomes a way to try to really break through that and show the normal lives of Native people out there in the United States.
Mm-hmm. I asked about this because once you said about this novel that it's a post-colonial novel, and I was wondering in what sense. Of course, there are many strategies probably to think about a post-colonial novel. It could be about reclaiming a voice. It could be about changing the narrative. I wonder, how do you perceive, let's say, the mission of a post-colonial novel? What would be the task of such literature?
Well, the way that colonization still exists in terms of the way that people perceive how natives should be, right? Colonization affects and spreads throughout by people's perceptions of the way that they think natives should act or should be. For example, the question of how native am I, blood quantum, right? If native is not necessarily about how much blood in native blood you have, right? And it's about your community and your enrollment and your active participation within within the community. But colonization says, well, you don't look native, because they already have this perception from stereotypes of the way that natives are supposed to look and supposed to act and supposed to talk, supposed to live, whereas that's not necessarily true, correct? And so so that's kind of natives are such a small percentage, right? And of people, and yet when we look at the United States, native land is everywhere, right? Native land is everywhere throughout the United States. So people acknowledging that we're on native land is a good step. It's a good first step, right? Not sure if I answered your question. The post-colonial, how it's a post-colonial novel, and that's part of it, was breaking through and discussing, looking at the stereotypes of identity. Sequoia Sequoia thinking about his identity as a native, Rosemary thinking about her identity as a native girl, and how non-native people view them differently. For example, in Where the Dead Sit Talking, there's a point where the foster dad tries to connect with Sequoia by wanting to build a teepee in the backyard, right? And that comes out of a very sort of stereotype colonization, right? Thinking that this boy is Cherokee, maybe I can connect with him by helping him build this teepee. But Cherokees never lived in teepees, so that's kind of a way of showing how naive that Harold, the foster dad, was, and yeah. So that's what I was interested in doing with this book.
I had the impression that in the closing scene, Sequoia, in a way, claims this teepee. He makes it his own.
Yeah, well,
Was that your intention?
Yeah, because he understands that Harold is trying to connect with him. The foster dad is trying naively as a non-native person and kind of stupidly trying to connect by not in a harmful way, but following into the stereotype of but he's trying, and Sequoia embraces that, even though he recognizes it's sort of dumb, that a dumb way to try to connect. He accepts it, right, and he knows that it comes from a good place, because Harold is a good he's a good person. He's trying. He's taking in foster kids, and so yeah. So he's trying, and Sequoia recognizes that.
Mm-hmm. So this strategy of writing through stereotype, as I see it now, from what you said, would be about showing a very emic perspective, just writing from the inside about particular experience, and in this way, dismantling the stereotype.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, again, the stereotype is dismantling the stereotype is a very nice way of putting it, and that's something that um, I was definitely interested in doing with this novel, and showing how naive people can be when they think about the way that natives should be. But also, I just wanted to show, this is a big book about Sequoia's identity and him trying to be, him being a 15-year-old boy and trying to figure out where he fits. The book is set in 1989. There weren't a lot of, there was not a lot of discussion, I think, at least from what I remember, about people exploring their identity and their gender and the way that they dress. And in a way, Sequoia is a very androgynous teenager. He's very androgynous, and trying to learn to accept that under the circumstances of his living conditions becomes very much of a challenge, because not only is he dealing with the issue of stereotype, being a stereotype native at school and in his foster home, but he's also dealing with the being stereotyped as just kind of a typical boy, right? That dresses as a boy, but he's interested in sort of taking on different. He likes Rosemary's clothes, for example, and he's very interested in trying. Going through Rosemary's clothes and maybe wearing them, and so there's a connection, not only because they're native, but he sees the way her style of dress and the jewelry she wears, or the shirts that she wears, as very appealing for him as a 15-year-old boy. And so the question of, is it okay? He's dealing with, is it okay if I look at her clothes? And today in 2021, a boy probably, it's not a big deal, but I think in 1989, it was a much more sort of, it was a much more probably controversial topic among young boys to explore identity in that way.
Mm-hmm. I was just thinking that well, a big part of this book is about communication in the sense of both self-expression and communication between people who come from different backgrounds with some baggage, let's say. And the TP scene is actually an example of how a stereotype can be a point of entry for a real connection, or just for a connection between people. Like you said, it starts from maybe a stupidity or lack of awareness, but the ending in this sense is very optimistic because they do communicate through it, the foster dad and Sequoia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's part of what I wanted to try to do, is try to break through that barrier and show that at least he's trying. The foster dad is, at the very least, he's trying to communicate and to connect with these kids who are not of his culture, and but there's a lot to be learned, and at some point Sequoia too, he comes to a place. I think he comes to a place where he feels a lot more. By the end of the book, he feels more comfortable being himself. When he shaves his head his hair into a mohawk, is to show that he's comfortable and sort of has accepted that he can have the courage to be himself, whatever that is, whether that's shaving his head, or whether it's wearing Rosemary's clothes, or thinking about his gender, all these, being androgynous, all these questions, I hope by the end he's come to accept.
Mm-hmm. Why did you choose the name Sequoia? Is it a reference to the creator of the Cherokee syllabary?
It is. The Cherokee syllabary was created by a man named Sequoia. So he's famous for that. But also, Sequoia is a name that some boys have. Some boys are named Sequoia. I grew up with a boy named Sequoia, a few years older than me, who I knew, and and I have known of other kids named Sequoia. So it's not. I think in the Native community, it's a reference to cultural, right? There, to non-Native people, there may be a name, Tana or Blue or Sequoia. There are many different tribal references, right, through names, and so so names become important.
Mm-hmm. But of course, in a post-colonial reading of the novel, I think we could probably read a lot into the significance of this name.
and that he's representative of a strong Cherokee boy, right? By strong, I mean culturally relevant, and thinking about his importance. The importance, Sequoia is very important. Sequoia, the inventor of the syllabary is very important to the Cherokee tribe and or tribes. There are three different Cherokee bands of Cherokee, and Sequoia is very important. And so that importance I wanted to filter through young Sequoia in this novel.
The theme of this year's festival is Nature of the Future, and I'd like to ask you also about the temporal frame of the novel, because it talks a lot about loss, of course. It's also about reminiscing, looking back, reflecting on the past, or even being stuck in the past, or maybe crippled by the past. That's the sense that I had while reading. So it's a coming of age story, but of a person who feels to be without a future in a way. And there's this sentence in the book that I noted, and it's for me it captures that very well. The air was heavy with the smell of dead things. For a very big part of the book, I would say that it's metaphorically heavy of the smell of death. The book, there is a lot of depictions of dead animals. The characters think and talk about death all the time, and the contrast between their youth and the topic of death is very powerful.
Yeah, and among native suicide among native kids is and has been something that I was interested in writing about, because it's along with any other community that feels like a band of outsiders, whatever that community is. If a kid feels isolated and withdrawn and not accepted for who they are, often leads to suicidal thinking, which I think here is with Rosemary, going on with Rosemary in this book, and with Sequoia. And so I wanted to touch on how dangerous that is, and suicide especially among Native teens, has always been a high number. So so I definitely wanted to draw attention to that.
I was also thinking about it as a maybe not unintentional, but a depiction of a certain crisis of social reproduction, because if we're reading about young people being hopeless and never actually projecting themselves into the future, always being in the past with their thoughts because of trauma, of course, feeling so stuck in their past, I thought that actually this is a depiction of a certain crisis of social reproduction. Would you say that?
Yes, I think I would agree with that. Yeah. it's also something that's not talked a lot about. It's not discussed. It's not, um, and not a lot of fiction has been written about thinking about it. So yeah, I think through my, that's one of the things I try to do through my art is really try to depict um, and and raise these issues.
Mm-hmm. Do you believe you're also teaching? You said you teach creative writing, right? At New
Mm-hmm.
Mexico State University. Do you believe in literature as a vehicle of social change?
Yes, I do. Yeah, I think I think literature is, as with all art, is a vehicle for social change. It can be a vehicle for social change, and I think all art should explore the human condition, right, and the the issues that I think we're facing all the time. We're facing today, and uh, it becomes a way to create thinking. Writing is a form of thinking, and I think reading um, certainly can. Uh, Reading different types of literature creates discussion and it creates thought, and so that thought and those discussions can lead to change. And the important thing I think about book groups that are popular over here is that as people read, as groups read together, those sort of discussions happen, and they happen a lot. And so we can use um, the awareness to that to begin to make change, and then people start doing things and they start paying more attention, and I think that's done through literature. Absolutely.
Did you have books that um, changed you or your way of thinking literature in a significant way? Do you have some milestone books?
There are a lot. It's that I mean the reason when I first went to college and was introduced to literature, there are several books. Um, is more specifically, are you asking about native books or about books that um, affected me thinking about different things? What more specific
Um, I'd
question?
be happy to hear about both.
Okay. Um, well, in college I started reading writers like Toni Morrison, Beloved, which is a beautiful book that I loved. Louise Erdrich is a native writer who just won the Pulitzer Prize last year. She's a very, uh, very powerful writer. Um, I N. Scott Momaday is an Oklahoma, Kiowa native writer who affected me um, and affected my style. I think he influenced my style
In what
through
way?
his through his depictions of nature and the drawing attention to the earth and setting. Um, James Welch is a writer. His novel "Winter in the Blood," I think, got me thinking a lot about voice and identity and loneliness, and through narrative. Those are big writers, and then I later became very interested in the books of Don DeLillo, who's an American writer, not a native writer, but he's an American writer, has become one of my favorite writers in the United States. But also, I there's so much I could go through. Like I love, I just love so much. I have a list of Edward P. Jones is a writer whose stories are very influential through his craft, and then European writers as well, like Yoko Tawada, and I became interested in surrealism and writing the surreal also, and so there are numerous European writers, I think, who and South American writers. Gabriel Garcia Marquez was an influence. Robert Bolaño. Right now, I really love Mariana Enriquez and her work. Yeah,
Are you
there's
in
so
any
many.
reading? Are you in any reading groups right now?
I'm not. No, I generally the reading groups I've been talking with, because different reading groups are reading my new book, and so I've been talking with different reading groups. But I usually will read. But I have many friends who have the same taste of literature as I do. So of course we talk.
Does it ever surprise you what the reading groups make of your work?
Yeah, it does. They ask a lot of times they'll ask very naive questions. I think a lot of reading groups really look for answers to questions, and I'm really interested in ambiguity, and part of that, and not just ambiguity, but again, I think about writing for myself. I think of myself as the reader, or someone very much like myself as the reader, and so I don't feel like I need to explain. And that's another question we talk a lot about, my native students, and that's a big discussion, is how much do native writers need to explain, right? And you don't want to feel like you have to explain every single thing, right? But you can do it in different ways. You can you can do it, for example, in there might be where a writer uses a phrase that someone would ask, "Are you a Cherokee Indian?" And that phrasing, natives, Cherokees would not use Cherokee Indian together, right? They would say, "I'm Cherokee," and the same thing with the language. Like a Cherokee would never say, "I speak." I speak the language of the Cherokees, right? They would just say, "I speak Cherokee," or "I don't speak Cherokee," right? But not the Cherokee language. So there are phrases, I think, and there are certain ways that writers can phrase the way that identity is stereotyped through non-natives, and I think that's one specific way, is thinking about how they're specifically phrased, right?
So, if I understood you correctly, it's also about not being didactic in your writing. I can totally
Yeah.
see how you being interested in surrealist writing. I can totally see the connection between ambiguity and surrealism.
Yes, surrealism. American writers like William S. Burroughs, an early influence probably too with surreal writing. Um, a lot of European writers
Does your
influenced.
taste for that translate into Where the Dead Sit Talking? I have my intuitions, but I'd like to hear that from you.
I don't really think of Where the Dead Sit Talking as a surreal book. I think my new one, The Removed, touches much more on surrealism. I think Where the Dead Sit Talking, if anything, may be more ambiguous than surreal. But again, without feeling, a big part of this is not over explaining culture or over explaining um, the way that characters, um, why they say or do the things that they do, and it should be sort of already understood by the reader. This is probably why. If everything's explained as a reader, for me, if everything is explained to me, it feels, it doesn't feel as powerful, right? As if I find myself asking, why did this? I wonder why this character did this, right? Why did this character say this, or do this, without the writer having to explain it to us? And it becomes the unspoken. I think, to go back to your earlier question, another early influence on me, the writer J.D. Salinger. Um, some of his, not Catcher in the Rye, but some of the other, some of his stories, about the Glass family, or in Nine Stories. Some of those, as a young, when I was a young person reading those stories, I think what I became fascinated by was what was not explained, or what was not spoken directly to the reader, but what was just sort of hinted at, insinuated. And that became the part of literature, I think, for me, that I became interested in how the writer is able to convey a specific message without giving a specific explanation.
Yes, and this is the kind of literature that stands the test of time. And I don't mean critically, just on a personal level, because when there is no one easy answer, then a rereading actually makes sense, and only provided, right,
Yes,
that there is no
right.
simple answer. And I was surprised when you said that the Trouts were actually this good family making an effort to accommodate the foster children, because maybe it was this sense of some kind of looming danger throughout the book that made me think that there is some hidden ugly secret that maybe will be revealed, and that wasn't revealed in the end. But there was definitely a lot of ambiguity also about that family in the book.
That's good. That's what I wanted. I wanted that sense of danger, because that, for the reader, hopefully is the same sense of danger that the children feel when they're around the family. Is this a safe person? Is this a person I can trust? Is this someone who's going to hurt me, assault me? Or is it someone being genuinely kind and generous, and trying to be nice? So the idea of someone being very skeptical of someone, right, who takes you in, who invites you into their home, right? I wanted to convey that sense of danger and also uncertainty through Sequoia's eyes, and through Sequoia mainly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I was also thinking a lot about the Generation Z, Of course, Sequoia is a teenager in 1989, but this sense of a looming disaster that is part of their experience now, the experience of their teenage years, it made seem the story very current. Or probably relatable. I'm not a Generation Z, but this theme of being young and concerned about the future, at least, to put it lightly.
Yeah, I'm not. I mean, thinking about generationally, and I was a young person in the 80s and in 1989, and I was young, and so when I think back, that's part of the reason I wanted to set this novel back then, and I was thinking of making references, pop cultural references to the 80s as well. And there's, for example, George, being on the autism spectrum, writes down the names of bands, music, and memorizes them, and so I there's some music references I think to the 80s.
The T-shirts with The Cure.
So yeah, I think Rosemary has a Cure poster or a T-shirt with Robert Smith. A lot of that 80s, because that's still a culture, still a time that I remember and feel like there's a lot of important pop culture there was in the 80s, right? It felt like it for me, being a young person, it was a very important time, and seeing how uh, um, impactful it was. So I made those references, in hopefully to show that young people. I mean, today I still see young people wearing the Cure T-shirts in 2021, right? And um, uh, bands, music, bands from earlier. I saw a Jimi Hendrix T-shirt the other day, and I own some T-shirts, right, that I think from the past. So I'm interested in thinking about pop culture in my books, not just in the way that it affects characters, but because I'm a fan of certain music, and I like to write about that a little bit.
I guess that's why I also asked about the reading groups, because it must be interesting to see how an audience that doesn't share your frame of reference reads the book without this context, not being able to recognize all the references.
Again,
That's
and I'm
probably a
not writing.
marginal.
Yeah, I mean, I think people who are a lot like me, and a lot of people, I think a lot of people might recognize those references. Who, again, I'm thinking of myself as the audience here, and I'm writing to please myself more than anybody else, and so that involves, making those pop cultural references. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of, it's thinking about what if the question of what if other people don't catch the pop cultural references that I'm making. I mean, well, so be it. I think the ones who catch it will catch it, right?
I think it's time to wrap up. Thank you again, Brandon, for the wonderful chat. Congratulations on your new book.
Thank
And
you.
we hope to see it translated into Polish soon.
I hope so. Yeah, I hope so.
And many thanks to everybody who tuned in to listen to our conversation today.
Thanks for everybody for listening. I appreciate it.